The golden haze of Venus hung heavy over the scorched, rocky landscape of the surface. Chase leaned against a jagged outcrop, his suit covered in the dust of 1,000 failed attempts. He thought back to the trial by fire that had nearly ended his journey before it truly began. Every step on this ground felt like walking through the heart of a furnace. The atmosphere had dealt him problem after problem, until his spirit was finally crushed. He looked at the horizon and saw only a beautiful, banana-colored goddess of death. Chase activated his comms, the static hissing like the acidic air around him. He asked Peter if there was any possible way to survive on this brutal surface. Peter responded immediately, stating that the chances of ground survival were effectively zero. The calculation was grim, predicting thousands of deaths over the course of 100 days. Chase felt the weight of that number, realizing he couldn't hack it on the ground. He admitted he wasn't strong enough and prepared to give up his mission. But Peter interrupted his despair with a mention of a hidden survival option. Chase looked up, urging the AI to spill the details of this secret plan. Peter reminded him of NASA's Havoc plan, a concept Chase claimed to remember. With a hint of sarcasm, Chase insisted he had definitely read the brief. Peter explained that Havoc stood for the High-Altitude Venus Operational Concept. The core of the idea was simple: massive, floating zeppelins in the sky. Chase's eyes lit up at the thought of building a true cloud city. NASA engineers realized that the surface was simply too brutal to maintain life. By floating 50 kilometers above the ground, the environmental pressure would match Earth's. Up there, the acid clouds would thin out into a more manageable environment. Peter noted the temperature would be a balmy 75 degrees Celsius. Chase retorted that 75 degrees was anything but balmy. He compared himself to Lando Calrissian, the Suavi leader of the fictional Sky City. Peter dryly remarked that Chase reminded him more of Jar Jar Binks. Chase feigned hurt, speaking in a silly voice to mock the AI's critique. Regardless of the insults, the mission was now clear. They needed balloons. He began workshopping names for the habitat while checking his equipment stocks. He reached out to his supporters, asking them to vote on a name for the new home. He warned them sternly not to name it Habity McHabitface under any circumstances. After resupplying, Chase donned his primary survival gear, ready for the ascent. He knew he had to focus entirely on the logistics of the aerial habitat. He admired the massive Zeppelin that Peter had managed to procure for him. Designing the layout of the city was a task that left no time for rest. He searched for his missing footstool, a small comfort lost in the move. Peter watched from afar, tracking every move Chase made in the new atmosphere. The Zeppelin was coming along nicely, looking more like a home with every hour. But the high winds began to buffet the structure, testing the seals for the first time. Chase felt a strange vibration under his feet, realizing the sky might be just as dangerous as the ground. Far below him, the surface vanished into a thick, impenetrable soup of acid and heat. He wondered if the thin fabric of his new home could truly withstand the 100 days to come. Peter adjusted his glasses as the holographic projector hummed to life in the dimly lit cabin. A glowing schematic of a massive, teardrop-shaped vessel appeared between them. He explained that the surface of Venus was a graveyard of crushed metal and molten dreams. To survive for 100 days, they had to look upward far above the crushing pressure. At 50 kilometers above the ground, the environment changed into something surprisingly familiar. The atmospheric pressure at this altitude was almost exactly 1 bar, identical to Earth's sea level. However, the air was not breathable, consisting mostly of suffocating carbon dioxide. Even worse, the clouds themselves were made of concentrated sulfuric acid droplets. This was the foundation of the HAVOC plan, the high-altitude Venus operational concept. The heart of the mission was a helium-filled airship designed to float like a boat on an acidic sea. Peter swiped his hand to reveal the internal structure of the gondola. Chase leaned in closer, studying the airtight seals and the carbon fiber skeleton. The airship would be covered in over 1,000 square meters of high-efficiency solar cells. Since Venus is closer to the Sun, the solar energy available was immense. This power would run the life support systems and the massive propellers required for stability. Chase asked about the winds, which he knew could reach hundreds of kilometers per hour. Peter smiled and explained that the airship would simply ride the superrotation of the atmosphere. It would circumnavigate the planet every few days, staying perpetually in the sunlight. But the deployment phase was the most dangerous part of the entire mission. The habitat would enter the atmosphere inside a protective aeroshell at orbital speeds. Once slowed down, a massive parachute would deploy to stabilize the descent. Then, while still falling, the airship would have to inflate itself with helium in mid-air. If the inflation failed or the fabric tore, the entire mission would end in seconds. Peter highlighted the special Teflon coating designed to resist the acid rain. This material was the only thing standing between Chase and a painful death by corrosion. The gondola beneath the balloon would house the laboratory and the living quarters. It was a tiny bubble of Earth-like conditions floating in a hostile alien world. Peter noted that the mission would start with a robotic precursor to test the winds. The sensors on the hull would monitor the chemical composition of the clouds constantly. Any sudden change in acidity could melt the seals within hours. Chase realized that he wouldn't just be a pilot, but a full-time chemist and mechanic. He asked about the backup plan if the helium started to leak. Peter replied that there was no backup plan for a total loss of buoyancy. Without the gas, the habitat would sink into the crushing heat of the lower levels. But the design was robust, using multiple independent gas cells to prevent a single point of failure. The plan was solid, but it required nerves of steel to execute. Peter deactivated the hologram, leaving Chase in the sudden silence of his preparations. He looked out the small viewport at the simulated Venusian sky on his screen. It was time to stop planning and start building his floating fortress. Just as he began the sequence, a red warning light flickered on the primary structural assembly console. The red warning light on the structural console cast a rhythmic crimson glow across Chase's determined face. He quickly tapped a series of commands into the holographic interface to diagnose the sudden system error. A digital readout confirmed that the pressure seal on the primary inflation valve was merely settling into place. With the immediate scare over, Chase initiated the grand deployment sequence for the massive envelope. Outside the reinforced glass, the compressed Teflon skin began to unfurl like a giant synthetic blossom. This was the most critical phase of the construction. As the helium pumps started their steady hum, Chase watched the external cameras as the Zeppelin's silhouette took shape against the swirling acid clouds. The wind shear at 50 kilometers altitude buffeted the half-inflated structure with surprising violence. He adjusted the gyroscopic stabilizers to compensate for the erratic movements of the platform. Slowly, the sagging fabric transformed into a rigid, aerodynamic teardrop shape. Chase realized that this floating fortress needed a name that resonated with the community following his journey. He opened a broadcast channel to his viewers on Earth, asking for their creative input. Suggestions poured in, but one name seemed to capture the imagination of everyone involved. Cloud City was officially born, a beacon of human ingenuity in a hellish environment. Now that the envelope was secure, Chase had to begin the internal modular assembly. He hauled the heavy oxygen scrubbers into the secondary life support bay. Each bolt had to be tightened to exact specifications to prevent leaks in the corrosive air. Hours passed as he worked through the checklist, his sweat fogging the inside of his visor. The air filtration system hummed to life, recycling the atmosphere for the first time. Chase looked out at the horizon, where the sun sat perpetually low in the thick haze. He knew that the solar panels needed to be deployed before the battery reserves hit critical levels. He activated the hydraulic arms that held the foldable solar arrays. A sudden gust of wind caught one of the panels, causing it to vibrate dangerously. Chase rushed back to the controls to lock the panel into its safety position. The mechanism locked with a satisfying thud, securing the energy source. Now, Cloud City was capable of generating its own power from the abundant Venusian sunlight. He finally took a moment to move his personal belongings into the small crew quarters. The photo showed his family back on Earth, a reminder of what he was fighting for. This mission was more than just a challenge, it was a testament to human survival. He spent the evening calibrating the long-range scanners to monitor the surrounding storms. The data showed a massive super-rotation current approaching from the east. Cloud City would have to ride these winds to stay in the temperate zone. Chase brewed a cup of synthetic coffee and sat by the window to watch the lightning. Blue bolts of static electricity danced between the clouds far below him. It was a beautiful, deadly world that didn't want him here. He began the first log entry of the 100-day challenge, marking his progress. "Day 1 is complete," he whispered into the microphone, "and Cloud City is holding steady." He double-checked the integrity of the airlocks before heading to sleep. The silence of the upper atmosphere was eerie, yet peaceful. Suddenly, a high-pitched whistling sound began to echo through the ventilation shafts. He checked the pressure sensors, and his eyes widened at the rapid drop in the main cabin. Something was puncturing the hull from the outside, and the toxic Venusian air was trying to get in. Chase grabbed his emergency respirator, but the whistling sound was growing into a deafening roar. Just as he reached for the patch kit, the floor beneath him buckled with a sickening metallic groan. The metallic floor beneath Chase's boots continues to vibrate with a low, ominous hum as he regains his balance. He exhales slowly, realizing the structural integrity is holding for now, despite the unsettling noise. Chase moves toward the main console to check the internal pressure readings of the helium cells. The numbers stabilize, confirming that the airship is floating at the target altitude of 50 kilometers. Outside the reinforced windows, the endless expanse of yellow-orange clouds swirls in violent, beautiful patterns. Chase begins his morning routine by inventorying the food canisters salvaged from the landing pod. He carefully organizes the resupplied oxygen scrubbers, knowing they are his literal lifeline in this toxic world. Survival here requires a strict adherence to schedules and resource management. He glances at the small sleeping quarters he has managed to assemble, a tiny island of Earth-like comfort. He places a single book on the nightstand, a physical relic of a home millions of miles away. The silence of the cabin is only broken by the constant whistling of the wind against the outer envelope. He walks over to the Venetian blinds he installed, adjusting them to see the horizon. The sun appears as a pale, blurred disk through the thick layers of the upper atmosphere. Maintenance is the next task on his list, starting with the solar panel arrays on the airship's spine. He steps out onto the narrow catwalk, secured by a heavy tether to the habitat's frame. The wind is stronger than he anticipated, pulling at his suit with invisible hands. He uses a specialized brush to clear a layer of yellow dust from the solar cells. He notices a small pit in the protective coating of a panel, likely caused by acid corrosion. The sulfuric acid in these clouds is even more aggressive than the initial report suggested. He applies a temporary resin patch to the site to prevent further degradation. After finishing the exterior checks, he retreats back into the safety of the pressurized habitat. The sound of the pumps equalizing the pressure is a comforting sign of functioning technology. To keep his mind sharp, Chase begins his daily exercise routine on a modified treadmill. Every movement is a struggle in the confined space, but necessary to prevent muscle atrophy. He spends the afternoon reviewing his journey so far, recording his thoughts for the community back home. He jokes about the lack of neighbors at 50,000 meters and the lack of decent coffee. But underneath the humor, the reality of the 100-day challenge weighs heavily on his mind. He checks the water reclamation system, which is currently operating at 80% efficiency. He adjusts a valve to increase the flow, carefully monitoring the digital gauge. The rest of the day is spent in quiet observation, watching the lightning dance in the clouds below. The storms on Venus are massive, stretching across hundreds of miles and crackling with immense energy. For a brief moment, Chase feels a sense of peace in the middle of this hostile environment. He remembers the name Cloud City and wonders if it will truly become a sanctuary. Suddenly, the stability of the room shifts as a massive thermal updraft hits the airship. The screeching sound of straining cables fills the cabin as the airship is tossed by the wind. He crawls toward the cockpit to regain manual control and stabilize the altitude. His fingers dance across the controls, fighting the erratic movements of the ship. Slowly, the airship levels out, the turbulence subsiding into a gentle sway once more. That was a close call, a reminder that the clouds are never truly safe. He notices a strange rhythmic tapping sound coming from the outer hull that he hasn't heard before. The tapping grows louder, sounding like something metallic is slowly being peeled away. The drop falls, sizzling as it hits the console, and Chase realizes the acid has finally found a way inside. The lone droplet of concentrated sulfuric acid sizzles as it eats through the polymer coating of the primary control console. Chase stares at the rising smoke, his eyes widening in realization that the habitat's hull has been compromised. He quickly reaches for a diagnostic tablet to pinpoint the exact location of the exterior breach. A high-pitched whistle begins to echo through the cabin as the pressure differential forces air through a microscopic pinhole. "Rico, why didn't the external sensors flag the acidity spike earlier?" Chase demands while toggling through menus. The AI's calm voice responds that the turbulence in the lower cloud layers has stripped the protective sacrificial layer faster than predicted. Chase looks up at the ceiling where more damp spots are beginning to appear like a spreading infection. He grabs a canister of specialized acid-neutralizing sealant from the emergency locker. The sound of his heavy boots rings out against the metal floor as he rushes toward the primary leak. He sprays the thick, gray foam onto the first sizzling hole, watching it expand and harden instantly. Suddenly, a secondary alarm blares, indicating a breach in the external solar array deployment mechanism. If the solar panels fail, the airship will lose the power needed to stay buoyant in the dense atmosphere. Chase realizes he has to go outside onto the maintenance catwalk to apply the sealant manually. He begins the grueling process of donning his heavy-duty pressurized EVA suit. The helmet locks into place with a mechanical click, sealing him away from the deadly environment. His own breathing echoes loudly in the confined space of the helmet as the airlock begins to depressurize. The outer door slides open, revealing the hellish, swirling orange void of the Venusian sky. He steps out onto the catwalk, the wind buffeting his suit even at this high altitude. Below him, the clouds stretch on for thousands of miles, a sea of toxic sulfur and heat. He reaches the solar array hinge and sees the acid beating on the critical electrical connectors. With trembling hands, he begins to scrub the acid away with a neutralizing brush.
Chase, your suit's outer layer is showing early signs of degradation. Peter's voice crackles over the radio.
Just a few more seconds. Chase grunts, applying a thick layer of sealant over the exposed wires. The status indicator on his wrist turns green as the connection is stabilized. He begins the trek back to the airlock, his movements sluggish from the weight of the suit and the stress of the repair. A massive gust of wind slams into the Zeppelin, causing the catwalk to shudder violently. He clings to the safety rail, watching as his sealant canister falls into the abyss below. He scrambles back inside the airlock and slams the manual override to close the door. As the airlock cycles, he collapses against the wall, listening to the comforting sound of oxygen refilling the chamber. Once back inside, he finds that the earlier interior leaks have formed small puddles on the deck. He spends the next several hours mopping up the acid with neutralizing pads and sealing the remaining interior pinholes. Every joint in his body aches, and the smell of sulfur has begun to permeate the filtered air. To distract himself, he looks out the window at the strange swirling patterns of the Venusian atmosphere. He notices the dark streaks Peter mentioned earlier, appearing like long, shadowy veins in the golden clouds. The idea that something could be alive in this corrosive nightmare seems both terrifying and beautiful to him. But the beauty is interrupted by a series of sharp, metallic pings against the outer hull. The pings grow in frequency, sounding like a hailstorm on a tin roof, but there is no ice here. "Rico, report! What is hitting the hull?" he shouts, rushing back to the flight deck. Detecting a swarm of high-velocity micrometeorites, structural integrity is failing at multiple points, Rico responds. A sudden deafening crack echoes through the ship as a large fragment pierces the main envelope, and the airship begins a sickening tilt into the abyss. The airship lurches violently as the hull breach causes a rapid loss of internal pressure. A high-pitched whistling sound fills the cabin, signaling that life-sustaining oxygen is escaping into the Venusian void. I scramble toward the maintenance locker, my boots sliding on the shifting deck plates. The AI voice of Rico calmly announces that oxygen levels have dropped by 15% in mere seconds. I fumble with the latch of the locker, my hands shaking under the intense pressure of the situation. Finally, the locker swings open, revealing the emergency sealant kits and specialized repair tools. I remember Peter's warning that pure oxygen mixing with sulfuric gases is a recipe for an uncontrollable inferno. A faint orange glow begins to flicker near the main ventilation intake, indicating the chemistry is already turning volatile. I sprint toward the vent, dragging the heavy sealant canister behind me. The smell of ozone and burning plastic begins to permeate the air through my suit's filtration system. I aim the nozzle at the breech and pull the trigger, releasing a thick, fast-hardening foam. The foam is immediately sucked through the hole by the external vacuum, failing to create a seal. I growl in frustration and realize I have to apply the seal from the exterior of the ship. Venturing outside in the middle of a pressure crisis is a suicide mission, but staying inside is certain death. I check my suit's integrity one last time as the airlock begins to depressurize. The outer doors slide open, and I'm met with the terrifying beauty of the Venusian atmosphere. The wind howls around the airship, threatening to tear me away from the safety of the hull. I see the breach, a jagged tear in the reinforced fabric glowing with an eerie, reactive heat. I crawl across the surface, the magnetic boots on my suit clanking heavily against the metal frame. Sulfuric acid rain begins to pit the visor of my helmet, blurring my vision of the danger ahead. Suddenly, a secondary explosion erupts from the vent, throwing me backward toward the edge of the platform. My tether snaps, taut, jerking my body and leaving me dangling over a 10,000-meter drop. I pull myself up the cable, my muscles screaming from the exertion and the thin atmosphere. I reach the breach again and jam the sealant nozzle directly into the fire's source. I empty the entire canister, watching as the chemical agent smothers the flames and hardens into a gray crust. The whistling stops and the terrifying glow fades into the dull yellow of the Venusian afternoon. I make my way back to the airlock, every movement feeling like it requires a monumental effort. Inside the habitat is a mess of charred equipment and floating debris. My bed is ruined, and my only book is a charred pile of ash in the corner. Rico reports that while the fire is out, the structural integrity of the main envelope is down to 40%. I realize that this floating paradise is far more fragile than I ever imagined. Through the window, I notice those strange dark streaks in the clouds again, moving with an eerie purpose. They don't look like dirt, they look like they are feeding on the sunlight hitting the upper atmosphere. I wish I could share this discovery with someone, but I am the only soul for millions of miles. The ship groans again, a deep metallic sound that vibrates through the soles of my feet. Rico, give me a status update on the exterior sensors. The AI responds that it has detected a massive thermal signature rising from the lower atmosphere. A sudden, violent updraft hits the airship, sending it spinning into a thick, impenetrable bank of dark clouds. I can hear the sound of small, hard objects pelting the hull like machine gun fire. Rico screams a final warning about an incoming swarm of micrometeorites that the sensors failed to track. A sudden deafening crack echoes through the ship as a large fragment pierces the main envelope and the airship begins a sickening tilt into the abyss. The airship groans as the tilt levels out, leaving Chase gasping for breath against the bulkhead. He slowly stands up and moves toward the reinforced observation port to survey the damage. Outside, the Venusian atmosphere swirls in endless patterns of toxic beauty. Chase notices long dark streaks cutting through the bright yellow clouds like ink in water. These mysterious markings remain stationary even as the high-altitude winds whip around them. Peter's voice crackles over the comms, explaining that these streaks have baffled scientists for decades. Some experts believe these streaks could be composed of iron chloride or even volcanic dust. However, a more radical theory suggests they are massive colonies of acid-resistant microbes. Chase realizes he might be looking at the first evidence of extraterrestrial life right outside his window. The detection of phosphine and ammonia in the atmosphere adds weight to this biological possibility. These gases are typically only produced by living organisms or industrial processes on Earth. For a moment, the isolation of the mission is replaced by the thrill of discovery. He prepares a sensor drone to fly into the streaks and gather a direct sample. The drone launches from the belly of the airship, diving into the golden mist. Suddenly, a proximity alarm on the console begins to chime with a frantic rhythm. Rico warns that a cluster of high-velocity objects is entering the upper atmosphere. A micrometeorite shower, remnants of a broken asteroid, is heading straight for his coordinates. Chase frantically initiates the emergency evasion thrusters to move the massive airship. The airship is too slow to maneuver out of the path of the incoming debris. The first fragment, no larger than a pebble, tears through the solar skin like a bullet. Alarms scream as the helium pressure in the main envelope begins to drop rapidly. A larger piece of rock slams into the habitat gondola, shattering the rear storage bay. Chase is thrown across the room as the entire structure lurches to the side. He hits the wall hard, his helmet ringing from the impact. Looking up, he sees the ceiling peeling away as structural beams begin to buckle. He knows the main habitat is compromised and won't stay afloat for much longer. The airship begins a slow terminal descent into the denser, hotter layers of the atmosphere. Chase realizes his only chance is the small, reinforced escape pod docked at the front. He lunges for the hatch, but another impact sends a shower of sparks across his path. The hull groans with the sound of dying metal as the pressure outside increases. Chase manages to pull himself into the tiny, cramped interior of the escape pod. He slams the heavy airlock door shut and engages the manual locking wheel. Through the pod's small window, he watches the main habitat start to break apart. He hits the release bolts, and the pod is violently kicked away from the dying mother ship. The pod tumbles through the air, spinning Chase into a dizzying blur of yellow and black. He fights the G-forces to reach the stabilization thruster controls. With a burst of cold gas, the pod finally levels out, floating on its own emergency parachutes. Chase watches the remains of Cloud City disappear into the thick clouds below. He is now alone in a tiny metal ball with only a few days of life support remaining. Just as he begins to catch his breath, a deep, rhythmic thumping starts against the exterior of the hull. The rhythmic thumping against the hull intensifies as Chase realizes the micrometeorite storm is far from over. A jagged piece of space debris pierces the ceiling, venting precious oxygen into the sulfuric atmosphere. Chase lunges across the tilting floor toward the small reinforced escape pod docked at the rear. The airship groans under the structural failure, tilting dangerously as the lifting gas begins to escape. He slams the hatch shut just as the main habitat section breaks away and tumbles into the lower furnace of the planet. From the small viewport, Chase watches his hard work vanish into the impenetrable yellow haze below. He checks his digital HUD and realizes he has exactly 10 days remaining to complete his 100-day goal. The escape pod is barely larger than a storage closet, filled with emergency rations and life support tanks. Day 91 passes in near total silence, broken only by the hum of the CO2 scrubbers. He ponders the strange dark streaks in the clouds outside, wondering if microbes are watching him from the acid. On day 94, a brief thinning of the clouds reveals the sun as a pale shimmering disk. The pod begins to drift away from his original coordinates, complicating his eventual retrieval. On day 97, the internal temperature begins to rise as the pod's cooling system struggles with the solar radiation. He rations his water carefully, taking only small sips as the heat intensifies. By day 99, the isolation has taken its toll, and Chase talks to the pod's computer just to hear a voice. Finally, the clock strikes midnight on the 100th day, and a loud chime echoes through the pod. Chase lets out a hoarse cheer, realizing he has survived the most hostile environment in the solar system. Now comes the hardest part, activating the ascent rockets to reach the orbiting recovery vessel. He grips the flight stick, feeling the vibration of the engines priming beneath his seat. A sudden hissing sound fills the cabin, and Chase realizes the acid has finally compromised the pod's outer seal. He has no time to lose and slams his hand down on the ignition button. The pod lurches violently as the solid rocket boosters ignite, kicking up a cloud of sulfuric mist. G-forces press Chase back into his seat as the pod accelerates upward at a staggering rate. He watches the altimeter climb rapidly, passing through the thickest layers of the upper atmosphere. The sky begins to change from a murky yellow to a deep, dark violet as he nears the edge of space. The violent shaking stops abruptly as the first stage boosters are jettisoned. Chase floats in his seat as gravity's pull finally releases its hold on him. He scans the radar and sees a blinking beacon representing the return ship, the Phoenix. The retrieval ship comes into view, its silver hull reflecting the brilliant, unfiltered light of the sun. Chase initiates the docking sequence, feeling the soft mechanical thud as the two vessels connect. The airlock cycles, and the familiar scent of clean, recycled Earth air fills his nostrils. He looks back at the planet Venus, a beautiful but deadly marble hanging in the void. He realizes that while Venus tried to kill him 1,000 times, he found a way to live among its clouds. Peter's voice crackles over the comms, welcoming him back to the world of the living. Chase records his final log, officially concluding the 100-day Venusian survival challenge. He knows that his data will help future explorers build a permanent home in the sky. The ship turns away from the goddess of love and begins its long journey back toward the blue marble of Earth. Chase settles into his bunk, the first real bed he has felt in over 3 months. He closes his eyes, dreaming of clear blue skies and the scent of rain on fresh grass. The mission is a success, and the story of the man who survived the clouds of Venus will live on forever.